Thanks everyone for coming today. We're excited to have you for our panel, The Wonderful World of Web3 and Investors' Perspective. So why don't we start with our panelists. Maya, why don't you start by telling us about yourself? How did you get into venture capital and when did you start investing in Web3 initiatives?
Awesome. Okay, thank you for having me. Thank you for having us, Chainalysis. So I first got into crypto when I was in college, and a friend of mine was using it to buy certain things, and I'll keep it at that. And
there's a lot of law enforcement here, by the way. No.
Yeah, please don't cuff me. So that's how I first learned about it. And I was studying business, I was studying finance, data science. I was really interested in this kind of concept of just the new technology aspect. And at the time, I put my money into crypto. I bought tokens only and thought I was a genius in the last bull market when I sold at the top. I then actually went into venture capital in a very strange way, where I worked, but prior to starting this fund, for a firm called 35 Ventures, which is the venture arm of an NBA player, Kevin Durant, and his business partner, Rich Kleiman. And during that time, I connected with Roham from Dapper Labs, and this was before they were launching Top Shot. And I followed CryptoKitties, and I kind of had this sense of, there's this, a lot of people think about crypto and they look at the financial use case, but there's also this whole cultural side, and we've seen it explode with the rise of NFTs. And when I spoke with Roham, I kind of had this instinct that he was the type of leader where he was almost early to the trend, like CryptoKitties put NFTs on the map. And then with Top Shot, it brought like mass consumer to this whole asset class. And so I made like my first angel investment into a crypto startup, into Dapper Labs. And from there, it kind of just snowballed. And my experience with Web3 now and kind of this latest wave has been really bridging the gap between consumers and just the normal person who doesn't spend their time in finance, and then startups and tech founders.
And Sigal, how about you?
So I had a very different path. I'm now at Ribbit Capital. We're a global investment firm. We've been investing in this space, in fintech crypto, for about a decade. I just reached my 2-year anniversary at Ribbit. But before that, I spent much of my career in and out of the public and private sector. So most recently, I was the Undersecretary of Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, where I oversaw FinCEN, OFAC, TFFC, a policy shop that did a tremendous amount of work also all over the world, leading FATF, leading the US team for FATF, among other things, an intelligence agency. And actually, I guess my first interaction with anything that looked like this was in the late 2000s when I was at the Justice Department. I was a Deputy Assistant Attorney General, and one of the cases that we brought was something called eGold. I don't know how many of you remember eGold, but it was pre-Bitcoin, and we found that the users in eGold had names like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, and we brought a pretty big case and brought it down. But I got specifically interested in crypto when I was at Treasury, and of course, our angle to crypto was how do we make sure it's not abused by illicit actors. And also, very importantly, as we did across our programs, we did a lot of work to provide guidance to the industry, because our view was, if you want to go after illicit activity, you got to tell people what the rules are, and you have to provide them guidance that allows them to track and trace and disrupt illicit activity, while of course allowing the incredible innovation that's happening in this space to prevail. Fast forward October 2019, I decided it was time to do something new, and I had become very passionate about disruptive financial technologies. And I became passionate about it because when I was at Treasury, traveling all over the world, meeting with heads of state on down and CEOs of banks, it became increasingly clear to me that our banks had massively de-risked all over the world. The continent of Africa, huge parts of the Western Hemisphere, the Middle East, Asia, et cetera. And I thought that was really bad for our country, and we could talk about why that happened. But I came to the conclusion that the only way we were going to change that dynamic, and also the massive unbanked, underserved problem that we have in the globe, was around disruptive, by promoting new financial technologies that could give many, many more people access to financial services. So I set out to figure out, okay, I have this passion, how am I gonna do that? Along the way, I met our founder, Mickey Malka, who founded Ribbit about 10 years ago. And although we had very different professional paths, we also had a very similar ethos. And so within a week after talking to him, he said, well, you know what, why don't you join Ribbit, and we can change the world of finance by investing in great companies like Chainalysis and elsewhere. And 2 years later, I'm all in.
So obviously the two of you have very different backgrounds. What's the investment thesis that guides your decision-making in Web3?
Yeah, I can take that. So my fund is called Spice Capital, and we're solving problems for the next generation of internet native consumers. So I'm focusing on really, really early stage companies, kind of providing them with guidance, incubating ideas, helping them go to market. And the thesis there is really, invest in what you know. I'm a product of this Robin Hood generation. I studied finance, but my first aha moment around what the power of crypto could be was seeing all these mobile tools and seeing that now anybody, regardless of their age, can have access to this whole ecosystem. And there was always a stigma and fear around participating in the world of finance. You have to have a certain number of credentials, et cetera. But with the internet, a lot of those barriers are removed. And so what are opportunities when you think about a teenager right now who views digital money just like paper money, and maybe attended a Fortnite or Roblox concert before ever going to a real concert, and grew up getting information on TikTok? How does that actually inform their decisions around money, around ownership, around information? And so kind of my focus around the fund is really looking with that lens and being this kind of bridge between what the rest of the world is doing and what this next generation is really spending their time on. So that's kind of how I invest.
So I would say our investment thesis, it's the same across Web3, fintech, early crypto. We really want to find great entrepreneurs, great companies that are going to change the world of finance and make finance more accessible to many more people. So I think we've invested in companies maybe in all 6 continents. Hundreds of millions of people have used the products that our companies have been part of, which is really very exciting. The other thing I think, again, this is long before me, Ribbit really had this great understanding that our cranky financial infrastructure, or creaky, sorry, it's not that cranky. Sometimes it's cranky actually too, but it's creaky. Financial infrastructure wasn't really built for 2022. It wasn't necessarily built for the modern world, right? We're still living on very, very old rails. And so what we see in Web3 and across our portfolio are people, incredible engineers, incredible dreamers, who are really building the rails for the future. And we've always really loved to back great entrepreneurs that have this vision for what the world should of financial services should look like. It's really telling that today, if I go to India, I can FaceTime my family, but try to send money back. It's a completely different story. And think about remittances, right? The market for remittances, it's massive, and yet the average cost is about 6% in fees. So, or access to capital markets, really complicated. So how do we build that infrastructure for the coming century and leave some of the old architecture behind? That's what's really, really exciting to us.
So what trends are you seeing now as you're investing amongst these Web3 companies? And are you finding that it really is that Wild West perception that I guess most mainstream people have?
So I love the Wild West question because I don't know how anybody could think it's Wild West after watching Jakob, Pratima, Michael, Jonathan's presentation from earlier today. And you're about to see someone from another one of our companies, Redefine, is building out like a cybersecurity dome. So if you really look at crypto, if when you say Wild West, you mean what we had in the really early days of the Wild West, which were people that were explorers and innovators and trying to discover the next world, then maybe yes, there's a Wild West. But trends, for example, what we're seeing are great companies that are building out infrastructure and guardrails to make it easier to use, to drive out illicit activity, to protect investors, to keep bad actors from being able to use and exploit it. I used to say this when I was at Treasury all the time. Our AML rules were stood up when we were still using the rotary phone. I don't know how many of you remember the rotary phone or ever used the rotary phone, but it was a very manual process. Today, you've got builders in this space in AML that are doing things in a fundamentally different, very exciting way that I think in the long run can really get the balance that we've gotten wrong for so long between driving illicit activity out and bringing more people access to a greater number of products. I think we can do much better there. So far from the Wild West, what I see every day when I talk to founders and our companies are people who are building out a sustainable financial future. What that's going to look like, nobody knows, but this is the amazing time, like the Wild West, to really experiment and discover.
Makes sense. Yeah, the infrastructure piece is really big. I think for me, like at the really early stage, so the past couple of years have been a lot of people who are really crypto native. So they kind of were bought into the ideology. They still are from maybe like 2013 all the way until recently. And those were the builders building projects. I think we're now seeing, because there was so much attention on crypto, you're now seeing builders come in from existing companies. And there's like an example I just saw. The Postmates founder is now starting a company in crypto. And these are people who really understand mass consumer businesses. And so I think there's this wave of new founders that are from Web 2 or more traditional backgrounds jumping in, and that really increases competition, but then it increases quality, I think, at the end. The other trend I'm seeing is a bit more like metrics-driven and metrics-driven go-to-market, more just, I think, thoughtful analysis of who are we going after. I think what happened was the past couple of years, again, there was so much activity that people were really just, one person would have an innovative idea and there'd be 5 copycats. I think people are really saying, okay, who is the consumer we're going after? How big is that consumer base? And if we're building B2B, what are the businesses we're actually selling into? And it's crazy to think that when you're in this crazy bull market, people don't ask those questions as much. Founders don't have to ask themselves because it's pretty easy to acquire new users. Now you're dealing with all the kind of the challenges of growing a business outside of crypto. So that's one thing. And the second thing that I'm seeing a lot is, people are now they're in the last wave as well, like EVM, like people were really building on Ethereum. That was probably the largest developer ecosystem. I think founders now in building are kind of looking through the trade-offs of, hey, actually, I'm looking for speed, or if I'm building for consumer, I need to keep costs really low and focus on gas fees. So founders now, it's not just I'm building in crypto, let me go hire a Solidity developer and build on Ethereum. It's like they actually have to make the decision of what chain am I going to build on, what are the trade-offs. And so that's really interesting at the early stage and something that wasn't as much of a thought maybe a couple years back.
So you just mentioned kind of like a technical consideration that you take when investing. But as I'm sure people are well aware, there are plenty of other kind of challenges or complexities in investing in Web3. I would imagine regulation is also one of them. So I'm kind of interested in hearing, what those are and to have you address the regulation piece as well.
Sure. So, it's long been there's always been there's been discussion for a long time about regulatory uncertainty. We heard it all the time when I was at Treasury, and one of the things that we did in response was issue guidance. We did this in December 2018. We issued guidance through FinCEN that explained to people what the rules were. When did the regs apply to them? When did it not? We didn't answer every question because we didn't know every permutation that was going to grow, but we had a real commitment to putting out as much guidance as possible so people knew, and then having real conversations and dialogue across industries so people could come in and ask us questions and understand, what could they do to meet their obligations. That's not the case, across the spectrum. There's still. I remember people used to complain to me all the time when I was actually at Treasury, like people are leaving, they're moving overseas because there isn't enough clarity. And at the time, I thought, okay, but we're still the United States of America. They'll always want to grow great products here. What I'm seeing is that's not the case. Actually, there is a ton of uncertainty in different agencies, and if we want to see this industry grow and prevail in this country, it's really paramount to govern through guidance and regulation as opposed to enforcement based on ambiguous laws. I'm optimistic that we're going to get to a better place, actually, when it comes to regulation. One, because the President Biden issued an executive order recently where he laid out 6 main objectives. Of course, there was driving illicit, making sure it wasn't abused by illicit actors, protecting investors and consumers, all extremely important. But he also included in those objectives, how do we use this technology to get to enhance financial inclusion? How do we have responsible innovation? How do we keep the United States as a center of innovation in a world where we face a lot of global competition, which if we're not the center, we're going to find that we're in a very bad place, in my opinion, from a national security perspective. So I know there's a lot of work right now that's happening in the agencies to try to figure all of this out. We will see where it lands. I'm also optimistic, by the way, about, I think there's going to be some storms, but I'm optimistic that we'll get it right in the long term, because I talk to so many people across the government who are really excited about this technology and what it can be and where it can go and what it can become. A lot of them are leaving government to go into it, but hopefully you'll continue to have sort of new generations of people who feel the same way and are very optimistic about the future.
And Maya, what other challenges or complexities do you see in backing Web3 initiatives?
Let's see. I'll go back to the early stage side. I think from one thing that's been a big consideration, normally when you're evaluating an early stage business, it's really about team, TAM, and whatever early product traction they have. And the question mark is around the TAM here, where something that a lot of founders are still working through is, and this is where it's such a fun job, is this, are we creating some sort of technology that's actually innovating the business model and creating a new TAM? Is that really what's happening here, or are we actually just focusing on an existing business model, but then they're finding some kind of untapped upside based off our technology? And I think knowing which bucket you fall into is really important as both a builder, but then also an investor, because the valuation, the amount of time you want to give to the company, the resources they need are really different for both of those challenges. And when you're, I think that's probably one thing that I see a lot of early stage companies struggle figuring out. And the other is almost, this might be new. There's a moving target of which layer one do I build on, right? So that's a huge question. And what you decide, we all believe in this future that will be multi-chain and there'll be more interoperability, but the tools and rails aren't there all the way yet. And so a lot of the early founders have to make that call pretty early on and kind of weigh the trade-offs. without knowing what the real TAM is down the line. And it changes so much, like, every 6 months, you'll see another layer one putting a big effort to attract new developers into the ecosystem. And so just thinking through where is the ecosystem going almost makes the founder have a little bit of an investor hat on as well, where they're predicting, where are we going to kind of build. And so that's been something I've been thinking a lot about.
And by TAM, you mean total addressable market?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah.
Total addressable market.
So what role do you think traditional financial institutions will have in Web3?
I think we saw it this morning, right? You had a leader in BlackRock speak as one of the fireside chats. There's a tremendous amount of interest in the more traditional sector in Web3 and crypto. They see, I think, more efficient ways of lending, of providing credit, of varied trading, and it's hard to watch this movement and efficiency and not get really interested and excited. I think they're slower to move for many, many different reasons, but we have people come to us all the time from more traditional financial institutions or other kinds of companies ask us, how do we get in? Like, what's happening? Where do you see it going? What are the trends? We don't want to get left behind. And as Maya said, you also have, it's not just traditional institutions, you also have CeFi getting into DeFi, right? In the last couple of days, Coinbase had a big announcement about liquid staking, and Robinhood had a big announcement about a free app to enable you to get access to Web3. So it's across the board, we are seeing this trend into something that is going to look quite different. Traditional finance, they also need to be confident, right, that it's going to be safe, secure, that they can do it in a way that meets their other risk-based, standards and regulations. But the trend is continuing. I think in the last week you may see a lot of people question it and naysayers, but you can't help but look across this entire ecosystem and not get interested and excited and understand that that there's a lot of amazing growth independent of one particular project.
Yeah, so actually, Maya, instead of you answering this, I want us to insert that question from the topic we were discussing backstage. We all have found that we have often heard entrepreneurs in crypto and Web3 talk about personal stories that have inspired them to work in this space. And so we'd actually like to just talk about that a little bit before we head to our last question. So what stories have you heard that have inspired you to either invest in entrepreneurs or have inspired you to work in this field?
Well, one of my founders started his crypto company at age 17, and it was because his parents were, they were in a bit of an oppressive situation in China, and the dad had this family business, and overnight, pretty much all of the money was kind of frozen, locked, not able to be accessed, and so they moved back to the U.S. And I think so. The founder was probably 12 or 13 at the time, and he just saw his whole life change in a second. And he came to America, the land of promise, and was like, what are other ways I can secure my money? What are ways I can get my parents back on their feet? And he dove in, entered the rabbit hole, was trading, exploring, and taught himself how to code, started to build, and now has a company. And it's stories like that that make you realize that, okay, there's this power here, there's a magic here of really leveling the playing field across the board. And when else in our history have we seen a global movement where anybody can participate? And I think that's what makes this really exciting for me, because it feels like in crypto you have your consumer is also your contributor. If it's a DAO or anyone can contribute to a protocol. So consumer is your contributor, is maybe your can also be the company itself. So it's cool. Everything kind of mixes together, and it's pretty interesting.
Sigal.
Yeah, similarly, we talk to founders constantly who came, often when we talk to founders, they'll tell their story. and before they talk about, sometimes even before they talk about their product. And it's consistently the case that we hear exactly those kinds of stories. There are so many people in this space who came to it because, for example, like our founder, he grew up in hyperinflation. He's from Venezuela, and his parents used to go to Miami and put their money in traveler's checks. Like, who remembers traveler's checks? But that's how or in cars, right? Because you weren't going to leave your money in the boulevard. That didn't make any sense. So if you look across this ecosystem, whether it's here or all over the world, you'll find similar stories. I have a similar family story where my parents came from nothing and they were hiding in the woods. And I always think about in their earliest days, and I always think about, well, what if they had a mobile phone? And they had family who was able to instantly transmit value to them that they could then use to buy food instead of stealing potatoes, which is what they were doing. The Ukraine story, I mean, it's just unbelievable how, first of all, there are incredible entrepreneurs and engineers. It's always been the case, many for a long time out of Eastern Europe, and in particular out of Ukraine. And when the war broke, they quickly understood with the Ukrainian government that, hey, they were desperate for weapons and food and shelter. And there is a way to safely and securely, instantly galvanize the entire crypto community to be able to transfer value, to help them very, very quickly buy those goods. I mean, there's some people who will say like, oh, it's never used for payments. Look at Ukraine. That's how they bought, a lot of the goods that they were able to buy. And it was something north of $100 million working with the government of Ukraine, which is really, really phenomenal. So my view is across this space, whenever you often when you talk to founders, they'll tell you, because they're dreamers, they'll tell you about what it was that brought them into this space. And the stories are really remarkable. By the way, as someone who came from public service, it's not that different. There's so many people who have come to public service because of something in their family history, whether they were the family history were Holocaust survivors, escaped the revolution, in Iran, were the first in their family to go to college. They were all driven to help this country because of something in their background that motivated them. People don't talk about like the similarities, but it's actually maybe a leveling, right? So if you're in both spaces, think about what's actually motivating people to do what it is that they're doing. And then you can have a really different conversation.
Yeah, and we've been saying for maybe 10, 20 years, we're a global economy. Everyone says that. And it really feels like maybe over the past 3-4 years, and with kind of the more mainstream adoption of crypto, we actually are becoming a global economy, and that's really powerful.
Very, very much the case. Yeah, trend, right? You talked about trends in DeFi, et cetera. It's these, you can, whether it's in decentralized finance and gaming and NFTs, these are global communities that are all coming together. You can be anywhere in the world and participate.
Right.
And it's really extraordinary.
All right, well, this has been such a fascinating discussion. Where would you recommend people who are interested in Web3 but don't know where to go? What resource would you recommend for them?
Your podcast, first of all. I think you have great podcasts, and a lot of people probably have learned a lot. There's so many resources. First of all, experiment. You have to actually, if you want to understand it, really understand what's happening, you have to touch the technology, go into communities, go into Discord, play around with it, see what it's all about. But there are tremendous podcasts. Chainalysis does a lot of that. Lots of other companies do, and the second you start searching, you're just going to find amazing resources to help you understand.
I think the really awesome thing about this industry is that people really build in public, and I haven't seen that in other technology industries. I mean, there's this concept, there's a big open source culture. People are literally, as they're publishing updates to their code, putting it on Twitter. And so if you are curious, you can watch a project unfold. You can see how they're growing, how they're scaling. You can see how many users they have by going on, an analytics dashboard and just seeing that right up front. And so just being online, I think but more tangibly, there's a book that I've recommended to a lot of people. It's called The Token Economy. I think it's how Web3, the token economy, we can link it out or something. That's a great book, and it kind of just goes through basic fundamentals. You have to definitely learn the fundamentals, and then what she's saying, participate, get a wallet, understand what it means to do self-custody, understand what it means, even if it's a small amount of money, what is DeFi, how can I borrow money, how can I lend money? Everything is really designed for, again, a global audience, and so I think anyone can participate. It's just a matter of putting in the time.
Yeah, and I would actually add, if you do check out my podcast and you're interested in some of those stories that have inspired people to work in this space, I would recommend these specific episodes. The interview with Wences Casares, who grew up in Argentina, went through 3 periods of hyperinflation in which his family lost everything. He tells a tale that sometimes when I retell it, I tear up. Roya Mahboob, who is pretty famous actually as a serial tech entrepreneur in Afghanistan. You probably have heard about the girls robotics team that she sponsored. They were rejected, I think, for their visa to compete at one point, and then they were able to get it through. But previously, she had done a startup with Bitcoin, paying women who in Afghanistan typically either don't have bank accounts, or if they do, their male relatives will confiscate the money from them. So she talked about that. Another one of her colleagues, Farashta Faru, also talked about this when Afghanistan pulled out of the US, how they were using crypto. And the last one that I would check out is the one with the NF Castle people. This is a royal family in the Czech Republic who had everything taken from them by both the Nazis and the communists, who turned NFTs. These are all inspiring stories. I think they really give you a sense of why it is that people are interested in this technology. Thank you so much.
Thank you.